The courtroom was buzzing with chatter, but the moment the bailiff called the next case, something unusual happened. All eyes turned to the wooden doors as a teenager, barely 17, walked in wearing an oversized jacket and a nervous expression. The judge raised an eyebrow and the gallery exchanged amused looks. No one expected the boy to walk in alone, without a lawyer by his side. It felt like the start of a scene nobody had rehearsed. People whispered, trying to guess what he could have possibly done. Some smirked, others rolled their eyes, and a few leaned forward, eager for a quick, entertaining show. After all, what chance did a kid stand against seasoned attorneys and a no-nonsense judge? To them, the answer was obvious. None. But what no one in that room realized was that this moment was about to change everything. Jamal's shoes echoed against the polished floor as he stepped closer to the front. He looked small compared to the tall men in suits who surrounded the courtroom, but his quiet confidence carried a strange weight. The judge glanced down at the paperwork, then back at him, and let out a dry chuckle. "You're representing yourself?" the judge asked with a half-smile. A wave of laughter rippled through the audience. Even the stenographer bit back a grin. It wasn't common to see someone so young standing without legal counsel. Jamal didn't answer right away. He adjusted the sleeves of his jacket and took a deep breath. His silence only seemed to make the room more dismissive of him. The bailiff cleared his throat, waiting for Jamal to speak. But Jamal remained steady, as if he was carefully measuring every word before releasing it. "Sir," Jamal finally said, his voice low but clear, "I know what I'm doing." The gallery chuckled again. A teenager claiming he knew how to handle court? To them it was laughable, almost ridiculous. Yet there was something unshaken in his tone that made even the most skeptical listener pause for a second. The judge leaned, back in his chair, folding his arms. "We'll see about that," he replied, with a smirk that hinted at disbelief. For Jamal, the laughter didn't sting as much as one might expect. He had lived with people's doubts all his life. Teachers who thought he'd fail. Neighbors who thought he'd amount to nothing. Classmates who whispered behind his back. Being underestimated was nothing new. If anything, he had learned to use it as fuel. As he stood in that courtroom, his heart pounded against his ribs, but his mind was sharp. Every book he had studied, every late night he had spent at the community library, every note he had written in the margins of borrowed law textbooks. They were all with him now, waiting for the moment he needed them most. But no one else knew that. To them, he was just a boy trying to play lawyer. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for the room to settle down. "All right then," he said in a tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let's begin." The prosecution stood ready, their briefcases stacked with files, confident that this would be a swift case. The audience leaned back, expecting a short spectacle before lunch. To them, Jamal's appearance was the punchline of a joke. Yet, behind Jamal's calm expression, a storm was brewing. He knew what he was up against, but he also knew something the rest of them didn't. He wasn't there to be laughed at. He was there to be heard, and when he finally spoke, the laughter in that room would freeze. The suspense hung thick in the air. Nobody could see the shift coming. Not the judge with his amused smirk, not the lawyers who already thought victory was theirs, not even the curious spectators who came only for entertainment. Because in just a few minutes, Jamal was going to turn that courtroom upside down. The echo of laughter filled the courtroom like an uninvited storm. Some people covered their mouths, trying not to be too obvious, while others didn't bother hiding their amusement. To them, this was comedy. A teenager, barely out of high school, claiming he could defend himself in court. It was the kind of thing people expected to see in a school play, not in a place where real lives and futures were decided. Jamal stood at the front, still and silent, letting the laughter wash over him. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the smirks, the folded arms, the eyes that judged him without knowing anything about his story. He had grown used to that look, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." The judge tapped his gavel lightly, though even he couldn't hide the slight curl of amusement tugging at his lips. "Let's maintain order," he said, but his voice carried a trace of mockery. His words weren't meant to protect Jamal from ridicule. They were meant to control the room's noise so the proceeding could continue. The prosecutor, a tall man in a crisp navy suit, leaned toward his assistant with a smirk. "This won't take long," he whispered, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. The assistant chuckled, scribbling notes that wouldn't matter, confident that victory was already theirs. Jamal's fists tightened at his sides. He wanted to shout back, to tell them all that they were wrong, but he knew better. Words without control were wasted. He had learned that lesson the hard way, so instead he breathed deeply and looked up at the judge. His voice came out calm. steady and stronger than anyone expected. "I'm here because I believe in truth," he said, "and I will not be silenced by laughter." The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. For a brief second, the chuckling stopped, replaced by curious silence. But then, just as quickly, the whispers and smirks returned. To them, Jamal's confidence was just another punchline. The judge shook his head slightly, his tone dismissive. "We'll see if your confidence holds when the prosecution begins." The prosecutor stepped forward, files in hand, and began presenting the case. He spoke quickly, his voice sharp, almost rehearsed. He painted Jamal as reckless, immature, and irresponsible. His words seemed heavy, as though they were backed by undeniable proof. Each sentence was designed to bury Jamal deeper in doubt. The audience nodded along, some whispering things like, "This kid's finished," or "Why didn't he just get a lawyer?" But Jamal stood there, listening carefully. His face revealed nothing. But inside, his mind was racing. He caught every detail, every small inconsistency, every weak spot in the prosecutor's story. The more he listened, the more he realized. This wasn't about how loud the prosecution's voice was. It was about how sharp his own voice could become. And soon, he would have his turn. As the prosecutor continued, Jamal's thoughts drifted briefly to the nights that brought him here. Nights at the community library, flipping through worn-out law books while others his age played games or went out with friends. Nights when he read court transcripts until his eyes burned, underlining words he didn't yet understand, but was determined to learn. He remembered the voices of those who doubted him. "You'll never make it. You don't have what it takes. Stay in your place." And now, here he was, standing exactly where no one believed he belonged. The prosecutor ended his argument with a flourish, clearly proud of himself. He looked at the judge with a smug expression, then back at Jamal. "Your Honor," he said, "this case is straightforward. The evidence speaks for itself. The defendant's attempt to represent himself is, well, nothing short of amusing." The room chuckled again. This time, the laughter was louder, bolder, echoing off the tall wooden walls. The judge turned to Jamal, lifting an eyebrow. "Your response?" he asked, half expecting the boy to stammer, to trip over his own words, to crumble under the weight of the courtroom's eyes, but Jamal didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, forcing everyone to wait. His eyes swept over the room again, at the spectators, at the smirking lawyers, at the judge who still didn't believe in him. Then he straightened his posture, his voice calm yet piercing. "You've all had your laugh," Jamal said slowly. "But I ask you this. If laughter is proof, then why do we need truth?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of unease spread across the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, the chuckles dying down as curiosity replaced mockery. For the first time, the judge's expression changed. His smirk faded, replaced with a trace of interest. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. And for the first time, the audience began to wonder if this boy, this teenager they had all dismissed, might actually have something worth listening to. Jamal's heart raced, but he didn't show it. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the fragile balance between ridicule and respect. This was his chance to tip the scales. He took a deep breath, ready to begin. And in that breath, the laughter stopped completely. The silence that followed Jamal's question was unlike anything the courtroom had heard before. Just moments earlier, laughter had rolled across the chamber like a wave, but now that laughter had died, replaced by something heavier: curiosity. The boy whom everyone dismissed as a fool had spoken words that demanded attention. The judge, who had been leaning back, in his chair with an amused smirk, now shifted forward. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in mockery this time, but in interest. The prosecutor's smile faded, though he quickly disguised it with a cough and a shake of his head. The audience shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by the sudden change in tone. Jamal cleared his throat and raised his chin. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it, a sharpness that cut through the silence. "The prosecution says the evidence speaks for itself," he began. "But evidence without context is like a story without an ending. It sounds complete, but it's not. And I intend to show this court the whole story, the truth that has been left out." A murmur rippled through the gallery. This wasn't what they expected. They had come for a spectacle, a boy fumbling through a defense he couldn't possibly handle. Instead, they were hearing words with the rhythm and weight of someone who understood far more than they should. The judge tilted his head slightly, curiosity overtaking his earlier sarcasm. "Go on," he said. Jamal took a deep breath. His hands didn't tremble, his voice didn't crack. He walked slowly to the evidence table where the prosecutor's files were stacked neatly. He pointed to the top sheet. "This timeline, the prosecution wants you to accept. Look closely. The witness places me at one location at 8:15 p.m. The official traffic camera, however, records me miles away at that exact same moment. How could I be in two places at once?" Gasps filled the courtroom. Several people leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another. Even the stenographer glanced up from her notes, her expression betraying surprise. The prosecutor's assistant began flipping frantically through the files, looking for an explanation. Jamal didn't wait for them. He pressed on. "This is not a clever trick," he said firmly. "This is not about me trying to sound impressive. It's about looking at the details that others chose to ignore. How many cases are lost because no one pays attention to the contradictions? How many lives are judged unfairly because people laugh before they listen?" The words struck deep. The judge's expression softened, shifting from skepticism to something closer to respect. The audience, once entertained, now sat in silence. Jamal's presence filled the room in a way no one had anticipated. The prosecutor straightened his tie and finally spoke, his voice raised in frustration. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. He's performing, not presenting. He lacks the authority to analyze evidence like this." But before the judge could respond, Jamal turned to face the prosecutor directly. His tone was sharp, but respectful. "Authority doesn't make evidence true," he said. "Facts do, and the facts contradict your story." The courtroom stirred again. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. The judge raised a hand to silence the whispers. His eyes never left Jamal. "Continue," the judge said quietly. Jamal opened his notebook, flipping to a section where the margins were filled with his handwritten notes. The pages were worn, edges bent from use, but the words inside were clear and precise. He held it like it was both weapon and shield. "I studied these documents carefully," Jamal said, "and what I found is more than one mistake. It's a pattern of ignoring evidence that doesn't fit, of shaping the story to match the assumption, instead of letting the facts lead to the truth." The audience sat frozen, caught in the gravity of his words. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing something bigger. The carelessness of assuming authority meant accuracy. The judge leaned forward again, his tone thoughtful now. "And what do you propose this court should conclude?" Jamal met his eyes without hesitation. "That the evidence is flawed," he said. "That the truth deserves more than laughter, and that justice requires more than assumptions." The room went quiet again, the silence almost electric. Jamal placed his notebook on the table with deliberate care, his posture steady. For the first time since he entered the courtroom, he wasn't just being tolerated, he was being heard. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smugness fading. The audience stared, not in ridicule, but in awe. Even the judge, once amused, now seemed compelled to listen. Jamal had taken the laughter that mocked him and turned it into silence that respected him. The shift had begun, and he knew this was only the beginning. The air inside the courtroom had changed. It was no longer a place of amusement where whispers and laughter filled the benches. Instead, every sound seemed amplified. The shuffle of papers, the faint creak of wooden seats, the measured breathing of those watching. Jamal stood taller now, his voice carrying not just confidence, but an undeniable authority. Moments ago, he had been underestimated, dismissed as nothing more than a boy trying to act clever. Now, the people in the room leaned forward, hanging on his every word. The judge, who had first chuckled at Jamal's presence, now studied him with narrowed eyes that reflected both curiosity and something like admiration. The prosecutor, once arrogant, shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced by unease. Jamal opened his notebook again, flipping to another page filled with notes and highlighted points. He spoke clearly, each sentence building like carefully laid bricks in a wall no one could ignore. "Your Honor," he said, "the prosecution insists that their case is airtight, but even airtight containers crack under enough pressure. And that's what's happening here. The story they've told this court is built on assumptions, but assumptions collapse when the truth is examined closely." He held up a report from the evidence stack and placed it on the podium in front of him. "This witness account," Jamal continued, "claims I was seen near the crime scene at a certain time, but look at the description given. It doesn't even match me. The height, the clothing, even the details of the voice. All of it is vague. All of it is unreliable. The audience stirred again. Several people exchanged glances, whispering quietly. The judge lifted the report himself and skimmed the page, his brow furrowing. He looked at the prosecutor. "Is this accurate?" the judge asked. The prosecutor hesitated. The witness was under stress. "It's natural for details to blur," Jamal immediately replied, his tone respectful but firm. "And yet, those blurred details are the foundation of your case. Should justice rely on blurred memories, or should it rely on truth that stands unshaken?" The silence that followed was powerful. Jamal's words had begun to pierce through the defenses of those who had doubted him. The prosecutor's assistant lowered her gaze, clearly unsettled. The audience, once entertained by what they thought would be a boy's humiliation, now found themselves pulled into a battle of wits they hadn't expected. Jamal turned back toward the bench, his expression calm. "When I studied this case, I realized something important. Justice is not about who speaks the loudest. It is not about who has the most authority. It is about who dares to stand for the truth, even when no one believes them." The judge leaned back in his chair slowly. His smirk was gone, replaced by a thoughtful expression. His gaze lingered on Jamal with a weight that suggested he no longer saw just a defendant standing before him. He saw something more. For the first time, the balance of the courtroom tilted. No longer was Jamal the subject of ridicule. No longer was he a boy stumbling in over his head. He was someone commanding respect, reshaping the very mood of the trial with each word. The prosecutor cleared his throat and stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, I must object. This is turning into a performance, a speech meant to sway emotions rather than present facts." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "He's using your evidence," the judge said evenly. "If that's a performance, then perhaps you should have presented it better." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face tightened, his confidence shaken. Jamal took a step back, his notebook held close to his chest. "I'm not here to perform," he said softly but clearly. "I'm here because my future depends on it, and I won't let laughter or dismissal decide what happens to me. I will let the truth decide." His words lingered in the stillness that followed. For the first time, the courtroom saw not just a boy defending himself, but the outline of something greater. A mind sharp enough to challenge authority, a spirit strong enough to endure mockery, and a heart courageous enough to fight for justice. The audience looked at him differently now. Some nodded in quiet approval, others whispered words of respect. The bailiff, usually unmoved by trials, found himself straightening his posture as if acknowledging Jamal's presence. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice quieter now, but laced with respect. "You may continue, young man," he said, and in that single sentence it became clear. The laughter that had once filled the courtroom was gone, replaced by silence, attention, and a growing sense of awe. Jamal had earned not only the right to speak, but also the respect of the very room that had once mocked him. The courtroom had shifted from mockery to silence, from disbelief to curiosity. Jamal, who had once been laughed at, now stood at the center of attention, commanding the room like someone twice his age. But he knew this was the moment to go deeper, not just to expose the flaws in the case, but to reveal who he really was, and why he stood there with such knowledge. He turned a page in his notebook, his hand steady. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but full of weight, "I'd like to explain something that may answer the question everyone here is wondering. How a teenager like me can stand in this courtroom and speak like this." The audience leaned forward instinctively. Even the judge raised his eyebrows, intrigued. The prosecutor crossed his arms, skeptical but listening. Jamal took a deep breath. "I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare," he began, "where most kids never thought about law or justice or courts. We thought about surviving, about getting through each day without falling into the traps that were waiting for us. But I was lucky. My community center had a small library, and in that library were old books. Books about history, about government, about the law. I started reading them, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand the world that judged us before. It even knew us." The audience was silent. Every word felt heavier than the last. Jamal's voice wasn't just telling his story, it was carrying the weight of countless others who had been overlooked and underestimated. "At first I didn't understand much," Jamal admitted. "The words were long, the sentences complicated, but I kept going. Every day after school, while others went outside, I sat at that desk in the corner, reading. And slowly, The words started making sense. I realized the law wasn't just rules written on paper. It was a shield meant to protect the innocent, to guard the weak, to ensure fairness. But that shield only works if you know how to use it. And too many people don't. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his eyes fixed on Jamal. The prosecutor's frown deepened, but he didn't interrupt. Jamal continued, his voice stronger now. So I studied more. I started taking notes, writing down every law, every case I could find. People thought it was strange. A kid in the corner reading legal codes instead of comics. But I knew one day it would matter. I didn't know when or how, but I knew knowledge is the only power no one can take from you. He paused, scanning the faces in the courtroom. Many of them looked softened now, touched by his words. The bailiff, who had remained stone-faced throughout, gave the faintest nod of approval. And when this case came, Jamal said, his voice tightening, when they pointed at me, when they laughed and assumed I had no chance, I remembered those hours in that library. I remembered every page, every line I had studied. And I realized I wasn't just defending myself. I was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been told they were too young, too poor, too different to matter. The courtroom was utterly still. Not a whisper, not a shuffle of paper broke the silence. His words carried through the air like a force no one could resist. Jamal picked up the witness report again, tapping it gently. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about the truth. If they can twist evidence against me today, they can do it to anyone tomorrow. But if I can stand here and prove that truth still matters, then maybe the next boy, the next girl, won't have to go through what I'm going through. The judge exhaled slowly, his gaze thoughtful, almost heavy with respect. The prosecutor opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Jamal's story had cut through every barrier of doubt. Jamal closed his notebook, his final words carrying a quiet power. I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came here to survive. But survival isn't enough anymore. I came here to show that knowledge, determination, and truth are stronger than any assumption, stronger than any laughter, stronger than any wall built to hold someone back. For a long moment, no one moved. The audience sat frozen, their hearts stirred by the raw honesty of the boy before them. The judge's expression softened, his earlier amusement replaced with something deeper, pride. Even the prosecutor, though still rigid, could not hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. The truth had been revealed. Jamal was no ordinary teenager stumbling in fear. He was a fighter shaped by study, by perseverance, by an unshakable belief in justice. And now the courtroom knew it too. The prosecutor's frustration was written all over his face. His jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, and his voice grew sharper with each word. Your Honor, he said, this boy is performing. He is twisting words to distract from the fact that evidence exists. He may sound clever, but clever words don't erase facts. The judge glanced at Jamal, then back at the prosecutor. For the first time since the trial began, the weight of uncertainty had shifted away from the boy and onto the man who was supposed to be in control. Jamal didn't flinch. He stepped forward, notebook in hand, and his calm voice cut through the tension. Facts? He repeated. Then let's talk about facts. He walked to the evidence table and placed his hand on a document. Fact. The witness claimed they saw me at the scene at 8:15 p.m. Fact. A traffic camera captured me miles away at that exact same time. Those two things cannot both be true. Which one is it? The courtroom stirred. People leaned forward, waiting for the prosecutor's reply. The prosecutor forced a smile. The witness was under stress. Memories blur. But the overall testimony is consistent. Jamal turned, his eyes sharp. Consistent. A description that doesn't match me is consistent. A timeline that falls apart under basic review is consistent. If this is what consistency looks like, then the word has lost all meaning. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. The judge lifted his hand for silence, but his eyes betrayed something new. Approval. Jamal pressed on, flipping open his notebook. His voice grew stronger, firmer, filled with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed not in front of mirrors, but in long, lonely nights bent over books. Let's be clear, he said. Authority doesn't make something true. Truth makes something true. If authority alone were enough, then mistakes would never be corrected, corruption would never be challenged, and justice would never evolve. But history proves otherwise. Authority has been wrong before, and authority can be wrong again. The words struck the room like thunder. The gallery shifted restlessly. Some nodded. Some whispered in awe. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, glanced at Jamal with the faintest trace of respect. The prosecutor's composure cracked. He raised his voice, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor, this is philosophy, not defense. He is weaving speeches to confuse the court. The evidence still stands." Jamal snapped his notebook shut, the sound echoing through the chamber. His reply was sharp but respectful. "No," he said firmly. "The evidence collapses under its own contradictions. And if you claim otherwise, then tell me this. Why does Section 12, Paragraph 4 of state law require courts to seek clarification when evidence conflicts with official records? Isn't that exactly what we have here?" The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He reached for a law book, flipping through the pages quickly. The room was silent, all eyes on him. Finally, he looked up. "He's correct," the judge said quietly. The words landed like a hammer. The audience gasped. The prosecutor froze, his mouth open but no words emerging. The assistant prosecutor fumbled with the files, pale with shock. Jamal didn't gloat. He didn't smile or boast. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had always known. "This isn't performance," Jamal said softly. "This is the law. This is the truth. And truth deserves to be louder than laughter." His voice hung in the air, reverberating against the walls of the courtroom. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The prosecutor stumbled forward, trying one last attempt. "Your Honor, we cannot let a teenager dictate the standards of this trial. He is young, untrained, and—" "Untrained?" Jamal interrupted, his tone rising for the first time. "You call me untrained because I don't have your title, but I have studied. I've pored over these books for years while others mocked me. I know the law not because it was handed to me, but because I fought to understand it. Tell me, what is more powerful, a title or the truth?" The audience erupted into gasps and murmurs again. The bailiff had to raise his hand for order. But this time the energy wasn't ridicule, it was admiration. People were seeing him differently now. No longer a boy on trial, but a mind sharp enough to challenge a professional. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, restoring quiet. His gaze lingered on Jamal, and when he spoke, his tone carried respect. "You may continue," the judge said. The prosecutor's shoulders slumped. The arrogance was gone. For the first time, he looked small compared to the boy standing across from him. Jamal took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before he spoke again. "This case is not about dazzling anyone. It's about survival. It's about ensuring that truth is heard even when everyone assumes it isn't there. If I can stand here today and prove my innocence, then it will mean more than freedom. It will mean justice is still alive." His final words sent a shiver through the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The laughter that once filled the courtroom was long gone. What remained was awe, respect, and the realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The turning point had come. The boy was no longer the one being judged. He was the one forcing judgment on the very system that tried to silence him. The courtroom was silent, yet it vibrated with tension. The kind of silence that doesn't calm but rather tightens around the air, pressing into every chest. What had started as laughter, whispers, and casual judgment had transformed into something far heavier, something unforgettable. Jamal stood in the center, the very teenager so many had dismissed, holding only a worn notebook filled with his handwritten notes. That notebook was more than paper. It carried the countless nights he had spent under dim lamps in his community center, reading, rereading, memorizing, and practicing. It carried the hopes of those who believed in him, the echoes of mentors who told him his mind mattered, and the silent prayers of his mother, who knew her son was destined for something greater. Today, in this courtroom, that notebook had become his shield, his weapon, his voice. The judge leaned forward on the bench, the stern lines of his face softened into curiosity, even respect. His voice, once touched with condescension, was now steady, calm, and serious. "You may conclude," the judge said. The words fell heavy, carrying the weight of authority. But to Jamal, they felt like an invitation. He stepped forward, placing his notebook gently on the table. His heart beat hard, but no longer with fear. It beat with fire, with determination. He lifted his chin, letting his eyes sweep across the courtroom. The prosecutor stiffened. The bailiff stood straighter. The audience leaned forward, eager, curious. Jamal began, his voice clear but calm, each word carrying farther than the walls themselves. "Your Honor, when this trial began, I was laughed at. Not because of what I had done, but because of who I appeared to be. A boy, a teenager. Someone too young, too unqualified, too insignificant to stand in this room and defend himself. That laughter wasn't just amusement. It was an assumption. An assumption that because I don't wear a lawyer's title, because I don't stand with decades of experience, because I am not what people expect, I would fail. He paused. The silence was alive now, stretching across the room like an invisible thread. But justice, Jamal continued, his voice rising, does not belong to assumptions. Justice belongs to truth. And the truth in this case is simple. The evidence does not hold. The witness statements collapse under the weight of time. The testimony contradicts itself. And by law, your law, when facts are inconsistent, when proof is weak, the charges cannot stand. The prosecutor leapt to his feet, his frustration boiling over. Your Honor! He is manipulating emotion. He does not understand proper courtroom procedure. He cannot be allowed to grandstand like this. But the judge raised his hand, his eyes never leaving Jamal. Sit down, he said firmly. Let him finish. The prosecutor froze, then reluctantly lowered himself into his seat, glaring at the teenager who had somehow shifted the entire courtroom's balance. Jamal's voice deepened, carrying more than logic now. It carried conviction. I studied the law because I knew one day it might be the only thing standing between me and a false judgment. I studied because I saw how easily voices like mine could be ignored, how quickly young people like me could be silenced. I didn't come here to beg for pity. I didn't come here to ask for mercy. I came here to demand justice, real justice, the kind that doesn't laugh before it listens, the kind that doesn't assume guilt before hearing truth. Gasps echoed softly from the audience. People shifted in their seats, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. A teenager wasn't just speaking. He was commanding the room. Jamal's hand rested on his notebook as though it were a living thing. His eyes burned with determination. You see, I may not have a title. I may not have years of practice. But truth doesn't need a degree to be spoken. Truth doesn't wait until someone is older, richer, or more powerful. Truth lives in anyone who dares to seek it. And today, I dared. He took a breath, and his voice dropped low, drawing the audience even closer. If this case continues, it won't be about justice. It will be about protecting assumptions. And assumptions, Your Honor, cannot replace facts. The room froze. The words echoed like a verdict themselves. Jamal gently closed his notebook, the final gesture of a man who had said all he needed to say. I rest my case, he said quietly. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then another heartbeat. The silence was deafening, charged with the gravity of what had just unfolded. The boy who had entered this courtroom to ridicule had left no doubt of his power, his brilliance, his truth. Then, slowly, something remarkable happened. A ripple of applause began from the gallery, at first hesitant, almost cautious, but then louder, stronger. It grew into a wave that filled the entire room. The bailiff shouted for order, pounding his hand against the rail. Order! Order in the court! But even he couldn't fully hide the small grin breaking through. The prosecutor's face turned crimson. His hands scrambled through his papers, searching for an argument, anything that could save him. But his confidence was gone, stripped away by a teenager who had dismantled his case, piece by piece. The judge lifted his gavel and banged it once, restoring order. The applause died down, though the energy still pulsed in the air. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on Jamal. This court, he said, his voice strong and deliberate, has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the arguments presented. It is clear, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the charges brought against the defendant are unsustainable, inconsistent, and flawed. Therefore, all charges are dismissed. The words struck like lightning. For a moment, there was stillness. Then the room erupted into cheers, claps, and shouts of joy. Jamal stood quietly, his head bowed, letting the moment wash over him. He was free. Cleared. But more than that, he was respected. As the crowd began to disperse, people came to him. Some shook his hand. Some offered quiet words. You were incredible. You've inspired us. You have a gift. The same people who had laughed at him when he entered now looked at him with awe. The judge remained seated, watching. Then, in a rare gesture, he called Jamal forward privately. Son, the judge said softly, his voice now filled with warmth. What you showed today was more than defense. It was brilliance. You didn't just argue, you taught. You made this courtroom remember what justice truly is. You should think seriously about becoming what you already are in spirit, an attorney. Jamal's Eyes glistened. He smiled, steady but humbled. Thank you, Your Honor. Maybe one day. But today all I wanted was to be heard. The judge nodded slowly, almost reverently. You were heard. Loud and clear. As Jamal left the courtroom, notebook pressed against his chest, the building no longer felt heavy. The laughter that had once filled its halls was replaced with respect. He hadn't only defended himself, he had defended the principle that truth, no matter who speaks it, can silence doubt, crush prejudice, and shine brighter than any assumption. And as he stepped outside into the daylight, Jamal knew something had changed forever. He was not just a boy who had survived a trial. He was a symbol, a reminder that greatness could come from anywhere, and that sometimes the smallest, most underestimated voice could thunder loud enough to shake the very foundations of power. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to Black Battlers so you never miss the next one. Your subscription gives us the power to bring you even more emotional and inspiring stories. Join the Black Battlers family today.